John Turner was an ordinary man, living in a small suburban town, tucked away from the hustle and bustle of the larger cities. His life had always followed a simple rhythm. Every day, he woke up at the same time, brewed a cup of coffee for himself and his wife, Sarah, then kissed their 2 children, Ethan and Lily, goodbye as they left for school. John was a mechanic by trade, spending long hours at his shop, where he worked with a small but loyal team. The job was straightforward, and the people in the town knew him as a good, hard-working man who always gave his best to everything he did. John took pride in his work and the life he'd built, and his family was the centerpiece of it all. They were a close-knit unit, a family who shared a lot of memories, laughs, and moments together. But lately, something had begun to feel different. The town was changing, and it felt like the changes were happening faster than he could keep up with. Over the past few months, John had heard whispers about the new policies coming into play at the local school. His kids had mentioned it here and there, new rules regarding the use of pronouns, some sort of policy meant to accommodate all gender identities. At first, John didn't think much of it. He was a traditional guy, raised with a set of values that had always worked for him. But his wife, Sarah, had heard more about it through their church group, and it started to make her uneasy. "I don't know, John," she'd said to him one night, staring at her phone after a conversation with one of their church friends. "I keep hearing about this new rule at school, and it doesn't sit well with me. They want the kids to refer to classmates by pronouns that don't match their biology. I mean, how are they supposed to just change that overnight?" John had shrugged, unsure how to respond. It wasn't a topic he cared to get involved in. He had enough on his plate running the shop and spending time with his family. But Sarah's concern had started to weigh on him. Their son, Ethan, was in his sophomore year of high school, and his older sister, Lily, was in middle school. They were both good kids, hard-working, respectful, and well-behaved. John knew that high school had a way of challenging a kid's character, but he always thought that if they just kept their heads down and focused on their studies, they would be fine. The pronoun issue seemed like something for the kids to figure out on their own. John wasn't sure how he felt about the new rules, but he didn't want to get wrapped up in a debate that he wasn't prepared for. Everything changed when he received a phone call from the school one Tuesday morning. It was the principal, Mr. Evans, and he requested that John come in for a meeting. He wasn't sure why at first, but when Mr. Evans briefly mentioned the new pronoun rule, John's stomach tightened. His gut told him that this wasn't a routine check-in about grades or behavior. The meeting was scheduled for that afternoon, and John spent the morning working in his shop, his mind wandering back to that phone call. Was this really about a pronoun policy? Could they be serious about forcing his kid to go along with something he didn't believe in? He wasn't sure what the answer was, but he knew he didn't like the feeling that was creeping into his mind. He knew there was something deeper at stake, something that went beyond just school policy. When John arrived at the school that afternoon, he parked in the lot and took a deep breath. The school seemed busier than usual. Kids were rushing from one place to another, and the chatter of voices filled the air. It felt like a typical school day, but the weight of the situation felt out of place. He walked into the front office, where Mrs. Johnson, the receptionist, greeted him with a polite smile. "Mr. Turner, right on time. Mr. Evans is expecting you. Go right on back." John nodded, his nerves starting to build. He made his way down the hallway, where he passed a group of students huddled around their phones. They barely looked up, but one of them gave him a passing glance, their eyes lingering for a moment. It made John feel uneasy. He couldn't quite put his finger on why, but something about the way they looked at him made him feel out of place. When he reached the principal's office, he knocked on the door. Mr. Evans, a tall man in his late 40s, looked up from behind his desk. "Ah, Mr. Turner, good to see you. Please, take a seat." John sat down, his hands resting on his knees. Mr. Evans wasted no time getting to the point. "Well, as you're aware, there have been some changes in policy here at the school. I'm sure you've heard about the new pronoun rules we're implementing for students. It's something we've been working on for a while, and we've received some positive feedback. But we also know that some families may have concerns. That's why we wanted to meet with you and address any questions or issues you might have. John sat up straighter, his mind already racing. Yeah, I've heard about it. My kids mentioned it to me, but I didn't know it was anything serious. Well, it's becoming a serious matter. We want to ensure that all students feel safe and respected in our school, and that includes acknowledging their preferred pronouns. So, as part of our policy, every student is expected to address their peers using the pronouns they identify with. This includes the right to change pronouns at any time, without prior notice. We're also providing training for teachers and staff to handle the situation appropriately, Mr. Evans explained. John's mind was spinning. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. Hold on a minute, he said, trying to gather his thoughts. You're telling me that my son is going to be expected to refer to someone by a pronoun that doesn't match their biology? Mr. Evans nodded. That's correct. John sighed deeply, the weight of the situation settling on his shoulders. I don't know, but I know this isn't something we can just ignore. We need to stand up for what's right. We can't let them tell our kids what they have to believe, especially when it contradicts the values we've raised them with. Sarah nodded slowly, her brow furrowed as she thought about the implications. I agree. But this isn't going to be easy. If this policy is in place, there are going to be a lot of people on the other side of this, people who think we're being close-minded or intolerant. John clenched his fists, feeling the surge of frustration rise within him. I'm not close-minded. I'm just trying to protect my family. And I'm not going to stand by while they push this on us. This isn't about being intolerant, it's about truth. My son shouldn't be forced to lie about what he sees. The conversation went on for hours that evening, the two of them debating the best course of action. Sarah was firm in her belief that they needed to address the issue head-on, but she was also scared of the backlash they might face. They both knew that standing up to the school district could come with consequences. The more they talked, the more they realized that they weren't just fighting for their own children. They were standing up for the rights of every parent who felt that their values were under attack. The next morning, John took a deep breath before heading out the door to work. He knew that the day ahead would be filled with uncertainty, and the thought of what lay ahead made him uneasy. But he was resolute. He couldn't back down now. Sarah had stayed up late the night before, researching the school's policies and looking into how other parents were handling similar situations across the country. They had decided that their first step would be to meet with the school board, to voice their concerns directly to those in charge and find out exactly how far the policy was going to reach. By the time John arrived at the shop that morning, his mind was spinning. He greeted his employees, trying to keep his usual calm demeanor, but inside, he was a bundle of nerves. He spent most of the day working on a car, the repetitive task giving him a small sense of normalcy. But every time he thought about the school situation, his stomach tightened. He couldn't get it out of his mind. During lunch, he stepped outside for a quick break and pulled out his phone to check his messages. There was a notification from Sarah. I scheduled a meeting with the school board for next week. We need to get our voices heard. John stared at the message for a long moment, the weight of it settling on him. This was it. There was no turning back now. He knew this meeting would be the beginning of something much bigger than just a disagreement with a school policy. It was about standing up for what they believed in, no matter the cost. Later that evening, after the kids were in bed, Sarah and John discussed the meeting. They were both anxious, but determined. They had to be prepared for whatever came next. The town wasn't large, but the school was a central part of it. If they made waves, they were going to make waves that would ripple through the entire community. John could already imagine the arguments that would unfold at the school board meeting, the looks of disapproval, the sneers from people who might think they were outdated or out of touch. But John knew one thing for certain: his family's values were worth fighting for. When the day of the meeting arrived, John and Sarah dressed carefully. They didn't want to come across as aggressive, but they knew they had to make their point. John wore his best button-down shirt, while Sarah chose a simple but elegant dress. They weren't sure what to expect, but they knew it was going to be a battle. They arrived at the school board meeting early, their nerves taut with anticipation. As they walked into the room, they saw that it was already filling up. Parents, teachers, and local residents were gathered, each one waiting to hear what the school board would say. John and Sarah took their seats, the tension in the air almost palpable. They were about to face the very people who held the power to decide the future of the town's education system, and they had no idea how the meeting would unfold. As the meeting began, the school board members introduced themselves, and the room fell into a respectful silence. Then, the floor was opened for public comments, and John's heart began to race. Sarah squeezed his hand for reassurance, and he gave her a brief nod. It was time to speak. John stood up, his voice steady but strong as he approached the microphone. He glanced around the room, seeing the expectant faces of the other parents, the concerned teachers, the school administrators who were there to defend the policy. He knew this wasn't going to be easy, but it was time to make his stand. Good evening. My name is John Turner, and I'm here today because I have serious concerns about the new pronoun policy that's being implemented in our schools. My children go to this school, and I'm not comfortable with the idea of them being forced to call someone by a pronoun that doesn't match their biology. The room fell silent, and John could feel the weight of every pair of eyes on him. He took a deep breath and continued, I respect everyone's right to live their life as they choose, but I cannot stand by and let my children be told to lie about what they see. I'm asking the school board to reconsider this policy and find a way that respects both individual rights and the values of families like mine. We deserve the right to raise our children according to our beliefs. As he finished speaking, John sat back down, feeling a mix of relief and apprehension. The silence in the room felt deafening, and he could sense the tension building. This was only the beginning, and whatever happened next, John knew that he had just set the stage for a fight that would determine the future of his family's education and their role in the community. He could only hope that the rest of the town would stand with them. The days following the school board meeting were a blur for John Turner. Every time he closed his eyes, he replayed the events of that evening. The room had been tense, thick with emotion. When he'd spoken, his words had hung in the air, and for a moment, he had truly felt the weight of his convictions. But now, back in the quiet of his home, he wondered if his stand had been enough. Did his words resonate with the board members? Had they taken him seriously, or had he just become another disgruntled parent, a lone voice in a sea of opposition? The morning after the meeting, Sarah had been the first to speak up. As she brewed coffee, her hands shaking slightly, she looked over at John, who sat in the living room, eyes fixed on the window, lost in thought. You did good last night, she said quietly. Her words, soft and encouraging, weren't enough to quell the unease gnawing at John. He knew that standing up was only the first step, but he wasn't sure what the next steps would look like. I don't know, Sarah, he admitted, rubbing his face with his hands. It felt like I was just shouting into a void. I don't know if anyone heard me, or if they even care. Sarah walked over and sat beside him, placing a gentle hand on his arm. They care. Maybe not all of them, but someone heard you. And we've just started. This isn't going to change overnight, John. You're not going to fix everything in one speech. He let out a long, frustrated sigh, feeling the weight of his responsibility. He wasn't just fighting for his own children anymore, he was fighting for all the families who felt powerless in the face of this new reality. This wasn't just about pronouns. It was about the kind of world they wanted their children to grow up in. And right now, that world was shifting in ways he didn't understand. Over the next week, John and Sarah found themselves in the middle of a whirlwind. The school board had officially taken the matter to vote, and the community had begun to split into factions. Some parents expressed their gratitude to John for speaking out, privately thanking him for voicing what they themselves felt but didn't know how to say. Others, however, were less kind. It didn't take long for word to spread that John Turner had spoken out against the new policy, and soon, the social media pages for the school district were flooded with comments, some in support, others outraged. John had always prided himself on staying out of the public eye. He was a quiet man, a worker, someone who didn't seek attention. But now, he was thrust into the center of a controversy that had the potential to fracture his town. One night, he checked his phone to find an inbox full of messages, some supportive, others filled with venom. "You're a bigot," one read. "Don't you want your child to be accepting of others?" Another said, "What's next, are you going to teach your kids to hate?" Sarah had also received messages. Some of her friends, people she'd known for years, questioned her beliefs. They asked how she could support such an outdated stance, how she could raise children in a world that was changing so quickly. She had tried to explain, tried to reason, but the more she spoke, the more she felt the divide widening. People who had once been allies now seemed like strangers, and it wasn't just the external pressure that was growing. The tension in their home, in their marriage, was becoming palpable. John was determined to stay the course, but it wasn't easy. His resolve was being tested at every turn. The following week, he got a call from his best friend, Mike, who worked as a firefighter in the same town. Mike had heard about the situation and wanted to catch up. John agreed to meet him at the local diner, figuring it might be good to have someone to talk to who wasn't wrapped up in the politics of the school system. When they sat down, Mike looked at him with a mixture of concern and admiration. "You know, John, I've been following what's going on. You're making a lot of noise, but it's not going to be easy. You're taking on the system. They don't like that." John took a sip of his coffee, feeling the weight of Mike's words. "I know. And honestly, I'm scared. I know this might cost me. It's already costing me friendships. But I can't just sit back and do nothing. I'm trying to do what's right, even if it means I have to lose some things along the way." Mike leaned forward, his tone serious. "I get it. You're standing up for what you believe in. But just be careful. You're going up against people with a lot more power than you realize. They'll come after you in ways you can't predict." John had always prided himself on staying out of the public eye. He was a quiet man, a worker, someone who didn't seek attention. But now, he was thrust into the center of a controversy that had the potential to fracture his town. One night, he checked his phone to find an inbox full of messages, some supportive, others filled with venom. "You're a bigot," one read. "Don't you want your child to be accepting of others?" Another said, "What's next, are you going to teach your kids to hate?" Sarah had also received messages. Some of her friends, people she'd known for years, questioned her beliefs. They asked how she could support such an outdated stance, how she could raise children in a world that was changing so quickly. She had tried to explain, tried to reason, but the more she spoke, the more she felt the divide widening. People who had once been allies now seemed like strangers, and it wasn't just the external pressure that was growing. The tension in their home, in their marriage, was becoming palpable. John was determined to stay the course, but it wasn't easy. His resolve was being tested at every turn. The following week, he got a call from his best friend, Mike, who worked as a firefighter in the same town. Mike had heard about the situation and wanted to catch up. John agreed to meet him at the local diner, figuring it might be good to have someone to talk to who wasn't wrapped up in the politics of the school system. When they sat down, Mike looked at him with a mixture of concern and admiration. "You know, John, I've been following what's going on. You're making a lot of noise, but it's not going to be easy. You're taking on the system. They don't like that. John took a sip of his coffee, feeling the weight of Mike's words. I know. And honestly, I'm scared. I know this might cost me. It's already costing me friendships. But I can't just sit back and do nothing. I'm trying to do what's right, even if it means I have to lose some things along the way. Mike leaned forward, his tone serious. I get it. You're standing up for what you believe in. But just be careful. You're going up against people with a lot more power than you realize. They'll come after you in ways you can't predict. John nodded, his eyes downcast. I'm prepared for that. I just don't know if it'll be enough. I've got a lot of people questioning me, and I feel like I'm alone in this. Mike gave a sympathetic look, reaching out and placing a hand on John's shoulder. You're not alone, man. You're just in the thick of it right now. But remember, sometimes, it's the loudest voices that make the most impact. Don't lose your voice. And don't lose your family in the process. John appreciated his friend's words, but the doubts still lingered. How could he protect his family if the community turned against them? How could he stand firm when the world seemed to be crumbling around him? Back at home, Sarah was struggling too. She had been to a few of the PTA meetings, speaking with other parents, trying to gauge their feelings on the situation. But the answers she was getting weren't comforting. Most parents were either too scared to speak out or too focused on just getting through the day-to-day challenges of raising children in an increasingly divided world. Many of them, Sarah realized, were quietly agreeing with John but didn't want to rock the boat. She felt isolated in her support for him, even though she knew deep down that she had to be strong. For her kids. For her family. When the day of the next school board meeting arrived, Sarah and John sat down over breakfast to prepare. The tension was thicker now, like the calm before a storm. They knew this meeting would be different. The board had already made it clear that they would be voting on the pronoun policy, and their public comments would weigh heavily on the final decision. John's mind raced with what he was going to say, but Sarah was quiet, her brow furrowed as she stirred her coffee. Do you think anyone is listening? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. John looked up from his plate, meeting her gaze. I don't know. But I can't just walk away from this. Not now. They were both putting everything on the line. And that night, as they stood in front of the board again, John's resolve was even firmer. He wasn't just speaking for himself anymore. He was speaking for every family who felt silenced, every parent who was terrified to speak up. When his name was called, he stood tall, his voice clear and unwavering. He wasn't just advocating for his own children, he was advocating for all the children in the room, for all the families who felt their values were being pushed aside in favor of a trend that didn't align with what they knew to be true. As the meeting wore on, John's words echoed in the room, reverberating off the walls, resonating in the hearts of the parents who were quietly nodding in agreement. But there were others, too, the opponents. Their voices grew louder, more defensive. The debate was fierce, and it wasn't just about pronouns anymore. It was about identity. It was about freedom. It was about what kind of world they wanted their children to grow up in. When the vote was finally cast, the room fell silent. The board members looked around, their faces unreadable. The decision was made, but no one knew how it would play out in the coming weeks. As John left the meeting, he had no idea what the fallout would be, but he knew one thing for sure, the battle had only just begun. The world was changing, but John Turner was deep. The days following the vote were a blur of emotions for John Turner. The outcome of the meeting had left him conflicted. On one hand, there was a sense of quiet victory, knowing that he had done what he felt was right. On the other hand, there was the unshakable feeling of being on the edge of something much larger, something that could change his life forever. The vote had passed, but it was far from a clean win. The division within the community had deepened, and the storm that had started weeks ago was only gaining momentum. People on both sides of the argument were more vocal, and the tension in the town was palpable. The days felt longer, and John found himself unable to shake the unease in his stomach. At home, Sarah had been quiet as well, her worries hidden behind a calm facade. It was clear to John that she, too, was feeling the weight of everything that had happened. Their children had been subjected to strange looks at school, whispers behind their backs, and comments from classmates who didn't fully understand the situation. It was the kind of stress that no parent could prepare for. The first few weeks after the vote had been the hardest. There had been no immediate consequences, no major fallout. But John could sense it coming. The whispers had turned into something more overt. The phone calls started, mostly from people in the community who had heard about his speech and wanted to either congratulate or condemn him. The first call was from his brother, Mike. "John, you have to know, what you did wasn't easy," Mike said, his voice heavy with concern. "But there's no turning back now. People are watching, and not just the school board. Your decision, it's going to resonate for a long time." "I know," John replied, his tone solemn. "I didn't think it would be this hard. The weight of it all, it's like I'm carrying the whole town on my shoulders." Mike had been silent for a moment before speaking again. "It's going to get harder. People are already starting to take sides. And when that happens, there's no middle ground. You've already made an enemy of some powerful people. But you can't back down. Not now." John leaned against the kitchen counter, rubbing his forehead. "I'm not backing down. But I'm also not prepared for what's coming next. The kids are starting to feel it at school. It's like there's a target on their backs now, or mine to change with it, on his terms." The days following the vote were a blur of emotions for John Turner. The outcome of the meeting had left him conflicted. On one hand, there was a sense of quiet victory, knowing that he had done what he felt was right. On the other hand, there was the unshakable feeling of being on the edge of something much larger, something that could change his life forever. The vote had passed, but it was far from a clean win. The division within the community had deepened, and the storm that had started weeks ago was only gaining momentum. People on both sides of the argument were more vocal, and the tension in the town was palpable. The days felt longer, and John found himself unable to shake the unease in his stomach. At home, Sarah had been quiet as well, her worries hidden behind a calm facade. It was clear to John that she, too, was feeling the weight of everything that had happened. Their children had been subjected to strange looks at school, whispers behind their backs, and comments from classmates who didn't fully understand the situation. It was the kind of stress that no parent could prepare for. The first few weeks after the vote had been the hardest. There had been no immediate consequences, no major fallout. But John could sense it coming. The whispers had turned into something more overt. The phone calls started, mostly from people in the community who had heard about his speech and wanted to either congratulate or condemn him. The first call was from his brother, Mike. "John, you have to know, what you did wasn't easy," Mike said, his voice heavy with concern. "But there's no turning back now. People are watching, and not just the school board. Your decision, it's going to resonate for a long time." "I know," John replied, his tone solemn. "I didn't think it would be this hard. The weight of it all, it's like I'm carrying the whole town on my shoulders." Mike had been silent for a moment before speaking again. "It's going to get harder. People are already starting to take sides. And when that happens, there's no middle ground. You've already made an enemy of some powerful people. But you can't back down. Not now." John leaned against the kitchen counter, rubbing his forehead. "I'm not backing down. But I'm also not prepared for what's coming next. The kids are starting to feel it at school. It's like there's a target on their backs now." "I know," Mike said. "But remember, this is about more than just your kids. It's about the whole community. You've sparked something here, John. The ripples will reach further than you realize." That conversation had lingered in John's mind, echoing in his thoughts as he walked through his daily routines. He couldn't escape the sense that he was becoming a symbol in a battle he never signed up for. His quiet, small-town life had been turned upside down, and there was no going back. But despite the growing pressure, John remained resolute. He had made his decision for his children, for his family, and for the values he held dear. He would not falter. However, it wasn't just Mike who had tried to reach him. The phone calls had continued, with one in particular shaking him more than the rest. It came late one night, after dinner. John had been relaxing on the couch, flipping through a magazine, when the phone rang. The number was unfamiliar, but something about it made him answer. "Hello?" he said, his voice cautious. "Mr. Turner," a woman's voice came through the receiver, cool and authoritative. "This is Linda Bryant. I'm a reporter with the local news. I'd like to speak with you about your comments at the school board meeting." John's heart skipped a beat. He had expected the media to take an interest, but he hadn't anticipated a call so soon. "I'm not interested in giving an interview," he replied quickly, trying to end the conversation before it began. "I understand," Bryant continued, "but I think you'll want to hear what I have to say. There are a lot of people in town who feel the same way you do, Mr. Turner. But there are also a lot of people who feel the exact opposite. Your speech has sparked a firestorm, and I think it's important for you to know how it's affecting things on a larger scale." John's pulse quickened. "What do you mean?" Bryant didn't hesitate. "There are factions forming. People are choosing sides, and it's starting to spill over into every part of town. The PTA is divided. Local businesses are feeling the pressure. And most importantly, your children, your family, isn't going to be able to escape the consequences. Not when you've made yourself the face of this issue." The words hit John hard. He had anticipated backlash, but this was more than just a disagreement. This was a movement. And now, his family was at the center of it. "I didn't ask for any of this," he muttered, feeling the weight of everything crashing down on him. "I understand," Bryant said again. "But it's here now. And whether you like it or not, you're part of this story." After a long pause, John spoke again. "What do you want from me?" Bryant hesitated before answering. "I want to understand why you did what you did. People want to know. The community is looking for answers, and I think you owe them an explanation. The truth of it, not just sound bites or political rhetoric." John swallowed, uncertain of what to say. The truth? He wasn't sure what the truth even was anymore. All he knew was that he had to stand by his beliefs. He had to be strong. "Fine," he said finally, his voice hardening. "I'll meet you tomorrow." That night, John barely slept. The thought of meeting with a reporter, of explaining himself to a public audience, sent a nervous knot twisting in his stomach. He wasn't a public figure. He wasn't prepared for the spotlight. Yet here he was, at the center of a firestorm that was bigger than anything he had ever imagined. The next day, he met with Linda Bryant at a local cafe. She was a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense attitude. As soon as they sat down, she wasted no time getting to the point. "So, Mr. Turner," she began, "can you tell me why you spoke out against the school's new policy? What made you take that step?" John took a deep breath, his hands trembling slightly. He had thought long and hard about this moment. "It's simple," he said finally. "I believe in the values I was raised with. I believe that children should be free to grow up in a world where they are accepted for who they are, but I also believe that there are boundaries. When the school decided to implement this new policy, I saw it as an infringement on my ability as a parent to guide my children in the way I see fit. I can't just stand by and let them be influenced by something that doesn't align with what I believe." Bryant leaned forward, scribbling notes. "But don't you think that in the pursuit of protecting your children, you're imposing your beliefs on others?" Some people see this as a step toward inclusivity, toward a more accepting society. John's eyes hardened. I'm all for acceptance. But acceptance goes both ways. It's not about forcing everyone to adhere to one set of beliefs or another. It's about respecting differences without demanding conformity. And I don't believe my children should be forced to accept something that goes against their core values. Bryant was silent for a moment, clearly processing his words. You know, this isn't just an isolated issue, right? This is part of a much larger conversation happening across the country. People are looking at you as a representative of the broader conservative movement. They're going to hold you accountable for your stance. John nodded slowly. I understand that. But I'm not doing this for politics. I'm doing this for my family. For my children. They need to know that standing up for what they believe in is more important than just going along with the crowd. After a long pause, John spoke again. What do you want from me? Bryant hesitated before answering. I want to understand why you did what you did. People want to know. The community is looking for answers, and I think you owe them an explanation. The truth of it, not just sound bites or political rhetoric. John swallowed, uncertain of what to say. The truth? He wasn't sure what the truth even was anymore. All he knew was that he had to stand by his beliefs. He had to be strong. Fine, he said finally, his voice hardening. I'll meet you tomorrow. That night, John barely slept. The thought of meeting with a reporter, of explaining himself to a public audience, sent a nervous knot twisting in his stomach. He wasn't a public figure. He wasn't prepared for the spotlight. Yet here he was, at the center of a firestorm that was bigger than anything he had ever imagined. The next day, he met with Linda Bryant at a local cafe. She was a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense attitude. As soon as they sat down, she wasted no time getting to the point. So, Mr. Turner, she began, can you tell me why you spoke out against the school's new policy? What made you take that step? John took a deep breath, his hands trembling slightly. He had thought long and hard about this moment. It's simple, he said finally. I believe in the values I was raised with. I believe that children should be free to grow up in a world where they are accepted for who they are, but I also believe that there are boundaries. When the school decided to implement this new policy, I saw it as an infringement on my ability as a parent to guide my children in the way I see fit. I can't just stand by and let them be influenced by something that doesn't align with what I believe. Bryant leaned forward, scribbling notes. But don't you think that in the pursuit of protecting your children, you're imposing your beliefs on others? Some people see this as a step toward inclusivity, toward a more accepting society. John's eyes hardened. I'm all for acceptance. But acceptance goes both ways. It's not about forcing everyone to adhere to one set of beliefs or another. It's about respecting differences without demanding conformity. And I don't believe my children should be forced to accept something that goes against their core values. Bryant was silent for a moment, clearly processing his words. You know, this isn't just an isolated issue, right? This is part of a much larger conversation happening across the country. People are looking at you as a representative of the broader conservative movement. They're going to hold you accountable for your stance. John nodded slowly. I understand that. But I'm not doing this for politics. I'm doing this for my family. For my children. They need to know that standing up for what they believe in is more important than just going along with the crowd. Bryant's gaze softened for a moment, and she set down her pen. I can appreciate that. But it's going to be a hard road, Mr. Turner. This issue is only going to get more complicated. Are you ready for the consequences? John didn't hesitate. I'm ready. I've already made my choice. The interview ended soon after that, but John's mind was left racing. As he drove home, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. The community was divided, and no matter how hard he tried to stand firm, the fallout was going to be massive. He wasn't just fighting for his children anymore, he was fighting for the soul of his town. And though he was determined to see it through, he couldn't ignore the fear creeping in. The world was changing, and John Turner had no choice but to change with it. The question now was, could he survive the storm he had stirred up? The days blurred into one another as John Turner navigated through the storm he had unleashed. The interview with Linda Bryant had aired, and the fallout was immediate and intense. What John had hoped would be a candid conversation about his values had turned into a media frenzy, with people on both sides of the debate taking to social media, news outlets, and even their own homes to discuss his stance. What had been a local issue was now a national topic, with various groups rallying to either support or condemn him. The phone never stopped ringing, and the emails piled up in his inbox. His name was now synonymous with controversy, and it felt like there was no escape. At first, the supportive messages had poured in. It was comforting to hear from those who agreed with him, who shared his values and principles. They sent messages of encouragement, reminding him that he wasn't alone in this fight. The local church community rallied around him, offering prayers and moral support. It felt like he had found a group of people who understood, who stood beside him despite the overwhelming pressure. But the negative messages were hard to ignore. The calls from angry strangers who didn't understand his decision, the emails from people who accused him of being outdated or intolerant, and the scathing articles that painted him as a villain, these were the things that kept him awake at night. His own children were starting to feel the weight of the public's opinions. His son, Jake, had come home one afternoon after school, his face pale and eyes swollen from crying. "They called me names today," Jake said, his voice barely above a whisper. "They said I'm a bigot, that I don't care about people." John's heart sank as he pulled his son into a hug. "Jake, you know that's not true," he whispered. "People say things when they don't understand. But you know who you are, and that's all that matters." Jake nodded but didn't look convinced. It was clear to John that his children were bearing the brunt of something they had no control over. The weight of their father's decision was falling on them in ways that John hadn't anticipated. The once peaceful, small-town life they had known was now filled with whispers, stares, and uncomfortable confrontations. But there was more to the story than just the personal toll on his family. The community itself had fractured in ways John couldn't have predicted. What had once been a town built on neighborly goodwill and shared values was now a battleground. The school board, who had initially passed the policy with relative ease, was now divided. Some members had publicly denounced John's comments, calling his speech harmful and out of touch with the needs of the students. Others, however, quietly reached out to him, offering support but urging him to keep his head down for the sake of peace. John had always prided himself on his ability to stay out of the political limelight. He had never been one to seek attention, let alone become the center of a media firestorm. But now, everywhere he went, people recognized him. Some were friendly, offering words of encouragement or praise for standing up for his beliefs. But others made their disapproval known through cold stares, harsh whispers, or open confrontation. It was exhausting, mentally and emotionally, and the stress weighed heavily on John. He couldn't shake the feeling that everything he had worked for, the quiet life he had built with Sarah and their children, was slipping away. One evening, after a particularly draining day, John sat down with Sarah at the kitchen table. The house was quiet, save for the sound of the clock ticking in the background. The kids were in bed, but the weight of everything that had happened was heavy between them. Sarah hadn't said much in the past few days, but John could see the toll it was taking on her, too. Her eyes were tired, and there was a furrow in her brow that hadn't been there before. He knew she was trying to hold it all together, but it was getting harder. "Sarah, we need to talk," John said, his voice low. "I feel like everything is falling apart. I never thought it would get this bad." Sarah took a deep breath and looked at him, her eyes filled with both concern and resolve. "John, we knew there would be consequences. We knew standing up for what we believe in wouldn't be easy. But I can't help but feel like we're in over our heads. The kids are hurting, and I'm not sure how much more they can take." "I know," John whispered, his voice cracking. "I never wanted this to affect them. I just wanted to do the right thing. But now it feels like we're drowning." But so is the right of parents to guide their children according to their own beliefs. You can't just impose one view on everyone and expect them to fall in line. What happened to respecting differences? The room erupted into murmurs, and John could feel the eyes of the community on him. This wasn't just about a school policy anymore, it was about values, freedom, and the right to choose. But as the conversation continued, it became clear that there was no room for compromise. The school board had made up their mind, and John's actions had made him an enemy in their eyes. By the time the meeting ended, John knew his days in the town were numbered. He had made his stand, and now there would be consequences. He had expected this, but knowing it didn't make it any easier. The community that had once been home was now a battleground, and John couldn't help but wonder if he had made the right decision. As he left the meeting, he glanced back at the faces in the room. Some were angry, others were confused, but all of them were changed. And as for John, he knew that no matter what happened next, nothing would ever be the same again. The storm had only just begun, and it was impossible to know where it would lead. But one thing was certain, John Turner had set the course, and he would have to live with the consequences of his actions, no matter how difficult they might be. The days following the school board meeting passed in a haze of uncertainty. John Turner knew that he had crossed a point of no return. As he looked at his family, he saw the subtle yet undeniable changes in them. Sarah, ever the rock, had grown quieter, her resolve firm but her eyes carrying a sadness he hadn't seen before. His children, Jake and Emily, seemed to carry a burden heavier than their young shoulders should bear. It was as if the weight of John's actions had become their cross to bear, and despite his attempts to shield them from the worst of it, there was no escaping the fallout. The town had changed too. Once a close-knit, supportive community, it had now splintered into factions. There were those who stood behind him, offering words of encouragement and support, their beliefs aligning with his stance. They called him brave for taking a stand in a world that seemed to be growing increasingly divided. But then there were the others, the voices of opposition that grew louder with each passing day. They accused him of being out of touch, of perpetuating hate in a time when inclusivity was supposed to be the driving force behind education. In their eyes, John had become a villain, a symbol of everything that was wrong with society. He tried to avoid the harsh words and bitter accusations, but they followed him wherever he went, tainting everything he did. It wasn't just the media or the public that was a constant source of stress. John's workplace, the job he had worked so hard to establish, was starting to feel the strain. The bank, where he had been a well-respected employee for over a decade, had made it clear that his actions were becoming a liability. He had always kept his personal beliefs separate from his professional life, but now, there was no dividing line. The pressure from the higher-ups was becoming unbearable. The emails from his boss were laced with passive-aggressive remarks, the subtle implication that his personal stance was costing the bank customers, damaging their reputation. He could see the writing on the wall, he would soon be out of a job if things didn't calm down. But in his heart, he knew he couldn't back down, not now, not after everything that had happened. One evening, John sat alone in his study, staring at his phone. The screen was filled with notifications, messages of support, messages of hate, news articles, and social media posts that had flooded in since his statement had gone viral. The world had shifted beneath his feet, and as much as he wanted to disconnect from it all, he knew that wasn't possible. People were talking, and no matter how much he wished to escape, his actions had placed him firmly at the center of the conversation. The school district's decision was final. They had taken the stance that John's public comments had endangered the safety of students, and they had moved forward with policies that made it even more difficult for parents to have a say in what was taught in the classroom. The administrators had met with the parents who supported John, offering little more than platitudes and the promise of working towards a better solution. The reality, however, was that the policy was now embedded, and the voices that had rallied behind John were growing more frustrated. Protests were being planned, and petitions were circulating. John's name had become synonymous with controversy, but not in the way he had hoped. It wasn't the recognition he wanted. But it wasn't just the town or the school that had changed, it was John himself. He had always prided himself on being a man of principle, of standing firm in his beliefs no matter the consequences. But now, the weight of those principles was crushing him. He had made decisions that affected his family, his career, his community, and he couldn't help but wonder if the price had been too high. Was it worth it? Had he made the right call? He could still hear the voices of his critics in his head, their words echoing in the quiet moments when he was alone. They told him he was selfish, that he had endangered his family, his children, and his future by taking such a public stand. But then, there were the voices of support. People reached out to him privately, telling him that he had done the right thing, that he had stood up for something that mattered. They reminded him that the path he had chosen wasn't easy, but it was necessary. They told him that he wasn't alone in his beliefs, even if it felt that way sometimes. These voices were harder to hear, lost among the cacophony of criticism, but John held on to them. One particular message stood out to him. It was from an old friend, someone he hadn't heard from in years. Michael Harris, a former colleague from his time working at a different bank, had written a lengthy message that began with an apology. Michael expressed regret over losing touch but also wrote that he admired John's courage. The message continued, offering support and understanding, reminding John that life was filled with difficult decisions, but that he was proud of the stand he had taken. For the first time in a long while, John felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, there were still people out there who saw the bigger picture. The message from Michael wasn't just words, it was a reminder that what John had done, what he had chosen to stand for, still had meaning. It had affected people, both positively and negatively, but it had sparked a conversation, one that wasn't going to go away easily. And that was something. Despite everything, John found himself at a crossroads. He had always been a man who believed in the importance of family, of community. He had never imagined that his belief in what was right would drive such a wedge between him and the very things he held dear. But now, the community he had spent his entire life in seemed to be unraveling. Friends had become enemies. Colleagues had turned their backs. His family, though supportive, was struggling to cope with the emotional toll of it all. His children had changed in ways he hadn't expected. Jake, once a carefree teenager, was now withdrawn, his once bright eyes clouded with confusion. Emily, too, seemed quieter than before, as if she was carrying a weight that no child should have to bear. It was the night after receiving Michael's message that John found himself at the dinner table with his family. The tension was thick in the air, but there was something different about tonight. There was a softness to it, a quiet understanding. Sarah had made dinner, something they hadn't done in weeks. It felt normal, almost like they were trying to find a semblance of the life they once knew. Jake and Emily, despite their quietness, were eating their food, looking up occasionally as if to gauge their parents' moods. There was no mention of the outside world, no talk of the school board or the media or the protests. For the first time in weeks, they were just a family. "How was your day, Jake?" John asked, breaking the silence. Jake glanced up, meeting his father's eyes for a brief moment before lowering his gaze back to his plate. "It was okay," he said softly. "Some of the kids at school still don't understand. They keep asking me why you said what you did." John sighed, his chest heavy. "I know, buddy. I know it's been tough. But you have to understand, sometimes we have to make hard choices, even if other people don't understand them. Emily, who had been silently eating, looked up at her father, her eyes filled with a maturity beyond her years. "Do you think it was worth it, Dad?" she asked, her voice small but piercing. "All of this. Was it worth it?" John looked at her, his heart aching. He had expected this question to come, but it still caught him off guard. He opened his mouth to respond, but the words didn't come right away. He had no easy answer. "I don't know, Em. I don't know if it was worth it. But I do know that I did what I thought was right. And sometimes, doing what's right isn't the easiest thing. But it's still important." The room fell into a heavy silence again. No one spoke for a while, but in that silence, John felt something shift. It wasn't an answer to all the questions, but it was something. He wasn't sure what the future held, but he knew that he had done what he could, even if it meant losing everything he once thought mattered. His family, his community, his career, everything was different now. But one thing had remained the same, his belief in standing for what he thought was right. The world outside continued to spin, and the noise of the media, the protests, the endless debates, would continue. But for now, in this small moment, John found a sliver of peace. He didn't have all the answers. No one did. But he had his family, and in the end, that was what mattered most. The rest would have to unfold as it would. What mattered was that he had stood firm, and no matter what happened next, he would continue to do so.